Wait, preview. I don't care. 2.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Renaissance Men podcast. I am Michael Parilla.
And I am Vishal Shah.
And today we are going to be talking about the rising tensions between the United States and Iran, as I'm sure many people have heard about what's been going on. But there's a long history between the United States and Iran that goes all the way back to the 1970s. And we're going to go through a lot of the events that have transpired between both countries. But the reason we're talking about this is obviously because of the recent killing of Qasem Soleimani, the second in command from Iran, who... the man has been responsible for the deaths of many, many people, both in the Middle East and of our own soldiers as well.
Right.
And there has been a lot of how would you word it? I would say sympathizing with him.
Right.
There, especially from people in our country as well.
Canada as well, and we can touch on some of the recent events that really kind of inspired this to be the topic of conversation for today. One of which is, we are hearing from 2020 Democratic candidates that this may be some type of political ploy. We're hearing from Elizabeth Warren that this could be a means of distracting people from impeachment, which, as we touched on before, doesn't really seem to be taking off the way that many Democrats had expected. We even recently saw in Canada that there was a public mourning for the death of Soleimani, and
some even labeling him as a martyr.
Right. And so that having been said, there's a lot of question as to why this attack took place on Soleimani, why now.
Yes,
and we can kind of go into that with pretty great detail, as, like you mentioned, we have a long-standing track record between us and Iran. We have a history that is rather telling to our current circumstances.
Yes, and before we go into that, obviously, like we said, the reason we're talking about this is the recent killing of Soleimani. But like you alluded to, as there have been people questioning the timing of the attacks, suggesting that it is an effort to distract from things like impeachment. I think that the people who are suggesting these things are forgetting that our embassy in Iraq was just attacked, and that was the reason that we retaliated against Iran and against Soleimani, because they were the ones coordinating and arming the people who attacked our U.S. embassy. And, people can go into the reason. There have been a lot of people saying that embassy was attacked because of our actions against Iran. And that's why we're going to go into the timeline of how this all started, because it matters who started the escalation and how exactly it progressed. So,
speaking very briefly on that most recent attack, for those who are unaware, a U.S. embassy in Iraq was attacked by Iranian-backed militias that have not only received funding and training from Iranian-backed forces, but are also directly tied back to Soleimani.
Yes, and that's why he was targeted.
Right, and so Iran is currently in the midst of what people are describing as at least 3 proxy wars, meaning that they are backing forces that are directly attacking the United States. And that having been said, the attack did result in the death of an American contractor, and there's actually video that you can also find on YouTube and online of the attack, just for reference.
Yes, and so going all the way back to the beginning of the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran, we have to look back at 1979, when during the Iranian Revolution, the U.S. embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran, was seized, and that damaged Iran's relationship with the West. And so right off the bat, this is a very important thing to note, because the initial souring of relations between the United States and Iran stemmed from the attack on our U.S. embassy in Iran. And now, in 2020, some 40 years later, another U.S. embassy in Iraq was attacked because of backing by Iran. And this is really important because embassies for centuries have, and by the way, it should be noted that a country's embassy is essentially that country's soil. So our U.S. embassy in Iraq is U.S. soil, and now people might question that, why that is, but we have embassies of foreign nations in our country that belong to those countries as well. And the reason for that is that it is important for diplomats to have a place that they can go and be safe and free under the laws of their own nation, so that they can operate in those countries and further the relations with those nations. And
particularly without the threat of violence.
Yes. And when you threaten diplomats, any threats and attacks against diplomats have been the cause of war many, many times throughout history. It's literally centuries. There's centuries of precedent for the harming of diplomats as being the onus for war. Because when you attack diplomats, when you make it unsafe for diplomats to operate within your own country, you effectively make it impossible for diplomatic relations to actually be had with your nation. Yeah. Because now there are no people that feel that they can safely treat with you from other nations.
Yeah, the phrase "don't shoot the messenger," it has been echoed for the past hundreds and hundreds of years in one capacity or another. And in fact, you had mentioned earlier one parallel.
Yes, even going as far back as Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan sent his diplomats to the Middle East to treat with one of the Muslim kings, the king cut the ears off of his diplomat and then sent them back to Mongolia, and Genghis Khan went to war with them over that. And this is not an isolated incident. Like I said before, there have been many wars that have been fought over the harming of diplomats. Harming diplomats, attacking embassies, that is one of the surefire ways to guarantee violent retaliation from a nation.
Right. It's one thing to attack somebody's military personnel, which is normally a very, very clear act of aggression, and but those are also military forces. It's another thing to, like you said, for example, attack diplomats. And one thing that is very representative through that is that there is no conversation to be had. The whole point of the diplomats is to negotiate and to strengthen relations and have conversations, etc., etc. But attacking diplomats literally means that you are refusing, or rather that you are losing any right to be able to negotiate, or there's a specific word I'm looking for, I think the point does get across.
I think that what it really does is it makes it impossible for people to treat with you, because now they have to fear that anyone they send to will be under threat of losing their life.
Furthermore,
and so it makes it not only, as you somewhat alluded to, not only revokes your right to negotiation, it makes it much less likely that people will be willing to negotiate with you. Because what guarantee do any of the negotiators have that they will walk away from that conversation without harm?
And furthermore, what guarantee is there that any negotiation or agreement that is arrived to will be upheld? And actually and
this is a particular issue with Iran, and so we're going to continue down the timeline. So, okay, in 1984, 5 years after the embassy in Tehran was seized, the U.S. State Department added Iran to its list of state sponsors of terrorism and imposed sanctions on them. And this was justifiable. Iran has backed plenty of terrorist groups, and they've created plenty of their own as well. So
that's, by the way, that's 1984, as you mentioned. So the claim that someone like Soleimani was directly involved with terrorist groups and terroristic actions that jeopardized the safety of American lives and additionally also Iraqi lives. This is something that we've understood as a constant of the relationship between us and Iran for
40 years.
40 years. Yeah. 45 if we're, about 46 years that's been the case.
Yeah. Well, for 36 years they've been added to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. But our relations with them do date back to like the early and mid 1970s. So, and specifically right in 1979 with the attack on our embassy. That in 2019 that was 40 years ago. So this has been happening for several decades. I mean, this is nothing new. It might seem like it's news to people who don't necessarily pay attention to these, or people who are too young to remember that. I mean, we're pretty young, but unless you actually look into these the timeline of these events, it can be difficult to understand how we got there, how we got to where we are, and that's why we're going through this. So, furthermore, in 1992, now almost a decade after that, almost a decade after we classified them as a state sponsor of terrorism, Congress passed the Iran-Iraq Arms Non-Proliferation Act, which prohibited the transfer of controlled goods or technology that might contribute to Iran's proliferation of advanced conventional weapons.
I believe this is specific to conventional missile technology. I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain of that.
Yes. And then in 1996, Congress passed the Iran Sanctions Act that penalizes foreign and U.S. investment exceeding $20 million per year into Iran's energy sector. So this is meant to put pressure on the Iranian government to comply with resolutions that would require them not to pursue more advanced weapons, essentially. And then in 2002, the National Council of Resistance on Iran, which is the political wing of the terrorist organization known as the Mujahideen, held a press conference to declare that Iran had built nuclear facilities near Natanz and Iraq.
Now, just for those who are unfamiliar with Mujahideen, if you remember the Save Our Girls campaign, that was this might have been something like 5 to 10 years ago. I'm not exact on the date. But essentially that thousands and thousands of schoolgirls were kidnapped and believed to have been sold into the human trafficking. And that this was carried out by Mujahideen, just to give you a rough idea of who we're dealing with here.
Yes. These are not good guys. I mean, they are a terrorist organization, and they hold quite a bit of sway in Iran. As it was stated, the National Council of Resistance on Iran, that's their political wing. That is the section of the Mujahideen that is actually active in the political process of Iran, of the Iranian governmental system. So it's not like they're just a terrorist organization. They actually have political power in the nation. Okay, so then a year later in 2003, the International Atomic Energy Agency, also known as the IAEA, their board of governors adopted a resolution calling for Iran to suspend all enrichment of uranium and required Iran to declare all materials relevant to its uranium enrichment program, as well as allowing for IAEA inspectors to conduct sampling at any location. And Iran agreed to the demands, and in an agreement with European foreign ministers, ratified an additional protocol requiring Iran to provide an expanded declaration of its nuclear activities, and granted IAEA broader rights of access to the country.
So briefly, because this will be very, very relevant as we continue on, what this means directly is that Iran will, with their declaration of their nuclear activities, means that they'd have to be very vocal about what they're developing specifically. And furthermore, with regard to the declaration of any materials relevant to their uranium enrichment programs, this is, by in part regarding nuclear energy, but also, of course, the more pressing threat of nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons, which ties back into what we had mentioned before regarding conventional weapons and missile technology, which will also play very relevant as we continue.
Yes, it is very important. Right. So then following the next year in 2004, the IAEA rebuked Iran for actually failing to cooperate with their inspectors. Basically, Iran was not allowing the inspectors to actually determine whether or not they were complying with the resolution. And Iran responded by refusing to suspend enrichment-related activities as they had previously pledged. However, Iran suspended them again for the duration of their talks with France, Germany, and the United Kingdom in accordance with the Paris Agreement. And as a result, the IAEA decided not to refer Iran to the United Nations Security Council. So,
briefly
Iran
explain
agrees.
this. Right.
Iran agrees to the resolution. They agree not to enrich uranium and to allow the IAEA to inspect their nuclear program and to declare what materials that they were using. And then they refused to allow the IAEA to properly inspect them. And then, following the IAEA's raised concerns with this, Iran then decided that they would continue their uranium enrichment, which flies in the face of the resolution that the Iranian government agreed to. And so,
now, by the way, just a quick touch on that. So there's a vast difference between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and not only do the materials have to be somewhat different, and someone can look into the nitty-gritty of that, but the key to this is that with their nuclear development, as far as their energy sector, we want to make sure that they're not looking towards weapons as well. And it's one thing for them to say that we want the ability to have nuclear generators so that we're able to essentially contribute to the building of infrastructure, but clearly that's not something we can take their word for.
Which is why we needed the inspectors.
Exactly.
And so they were refusing the inspectors to actually do their job.
Which is highly suspicious, and something that will be echoed later as well. So you were continuing 2005.
I just wanted to
Sure.
continue with the point that I was making, which is that, right, so the IAEA raises their concerns, and so usually this would mean that they would refer Iran to the UN Security Council. However, Iran, like I stated, began talks with France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And so because of the Paris Agreement, Iran said, okay, because we are now in negotiations with these three countries, we will temporarily suspend our uranium enrichment. And so as a result of that, the IAEA didn't refer them to the UN Security Council for the duration of the talks. And then a year later, in 2005, Russia and Iran reached a nuclear fuel supply agreement in which Russia would provide fuel for Iran's nuclear reactor in Bushehr, and Iran would return the spent nuclear fuel back to Russia, which is an arrangement aimed at preventing Iran from extracting plutonium for nuclear weapons from the spent nuclear fuel. However, Iran began producing uranium hexafluoride at its facility in Isfahan, and as a result, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom halted their negotiations with Iran. And following that, the IAEA adopted a resolution finding Iran in non-compliance with its safeguards agreement, paving the way for a referral to the UN Security Council.
So, diving into this a little bit. Now, Russia is, and just to reiterate what we've just mentioned, is supplying Iran with the materials for them to be able to continue their nuclear research, contingent on the idea that Iran will actually return the spent nuclear materials that might be then converted to weapons technology back to Russia. So, I mean, I want to make sure that was very clear. Russia's essentially letting Iran continue its nuclear technology on the contingent on the idea that they're going to actually help Russia with their own nuclear proliferation.
Yes, because the spent nuclear fuel that they were concerned with Iran using for weapons, Russia can now use for weapons because Iran is returning them to Russia. So that allows Russia to increase their own nuclear arsenal. And also, I mean, following this was actually the reason that France, Germany, and the UK halted their negotiations. That and the fact that Iran was producing uranium hexafluoride. And so now they ended up getting referred to the UN Security Council.
And it is pretty insane. I mean, we're seeing two antagonistic powers in a dangerously mutually beneficial agreement.
Yes, well, Russia is one of Iran's very few allies. And we can see now the beginnings of this all the way in 2005, which was 15 years ago.
And by the way, Twitter has been, covered with memes and jokes about World War III and a draft. And while I mean, we can get into this a little bit later. While I don't think that this is the precursor to a World War III, Russia being one of their allies does play into the very small, in my opinion, possibility of something like that. And again, I really don't think that that's going to happen, given the circumstances. And we can explain a little bit why later. But Russia being one of their few allies is actually one of those reasons that people think that this could be an escalating situation. Because with recent actions in which Iran is actually doing something similar, we may see yet another event in which multiple Western powers are going to intervene and sanction, at the very least, hold Iran accountable to their nuclear development. And so this could be an incredibly influential part of how this continues, especially from the end of foreign diplomacy and where Iran is getting its support. Because its support from Russia can be incredibly influential to the whole circumstance as this continues.
It can. Personally, I don't think that World War III is something that is going to happen. There are a lot of ways that this could go, but you have to remember that this isn't just about the U.S. and Russia, and the stance that other nations take in this will go a long way in determining what exactly is going to happen. I think that has a lot to do with how Iran might respond to the recent killing of Soleimani, which is something that we can't predict. The ball is in their court, but how they respond in many ways determines how we will respond. And so,
and the history that we're depicting as well are going through.
But
also has
one
a
thing
huge,
that I do want to touch on is that I have seen some people remarking that Trump did this because he's Putin's puppet or something, or that Putin wanted him to do this, which doesn't make any sense. Because Iran is Russia's ally. Putin, there's no reason that Putin would want this to happen. Like these are ideas. Like it's very weird to me that Trump can do so many things. I mean, this is only one instance, but he can do so many things that clearly are against the interest of the Russians and against the interest of Putin, and yet people will still claim that he's a Russian stooge because we still have not moved past this theory that Russia is responsible for Trump's election, which is not true. And yet people they feel like they have to stick with this as though it is a valid criticism, but it's not. And it's just, I wish that we could actually look at situations like this from an objective perspective and understand that this is clearly not something that Russia would want.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conflict between us and one of their allies, and like you said, there's no way that this really plays into Russia's favor. And that having been said, I'm sure that there's some left-wing pundit out there or theorist in some think tank who could try to draw some connection. I mean, in life, if you look for a connection, you can find one. We have a word for that. It's paranoia. If you want to find a connection between two things that are seemingly totally disconnected, I'm sure you can find one, but that doesn't mean that it's a reasonable connection. And normally, if you're going to draw such a connection, that's going to be it's something that is verifiable by future actions. If you want to say that Trump is a Russian asset, for example, well, this is one thing that kind of is evidence against that.
Yes.
And I'm sure you can try to draw another conclusion, but the evidence will continue to show that that isn't the case. And, I can't predict the future, but that's what the evidence has shown so far. So that's what I'm going to base my prediction, my opinions off of.
Absolutely. And so moving forward, now we are in 2006, in which Iran, so they're finally referred to the UN Security Council by the IAEA, and a resolution is passed requiring Iran to suspend its enrichment of uranium, reconsider the construction of the heavy water reactor in Iraq, and ratify an additional protocol to its safeguards agreement, and fully cooperate with the IAEA's investigation. Iran then told the IAEA that it would stop implementing an additional protocol and other inspection procedures. 2 months later, Iran announced that it had enriched uranium for the first time. Following this, China, France, Germany, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States proposed a framework offering incentives for Iran to halt its enrichment program. Iran rejected the proposal, and the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on Iran, prohibiting countries from transferring sensitive nuclear and missile-related technology to Iran, and required that all countries freeze the assets of 10 Iranian organizations and 12 individuals for their involvement in Iran's nuclear program. So, Iran is finally referred to the UN Security Council. The UN passes a resolution, and they say that, okay, you have to stop enriching uranium. You should, they said you should reconsider the construction of the heavy water reactor, which means that they didn't necessarily ban it outright, but they said, hey, maybe you might not want to do this if you don't want to essentially anger us more.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're not going to allow you to enrich uranium, there's no good reason to try to build a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
And of course, if you are going to build that nuclear reactor, then I doubt that you're going to comply with the agreement that we've just met. And by the way, that was Iraq, A-R-A-K,
yes,
not Iraq.
Yes, no.
So I just want to draw that distinction.
Yes, and also, right, so they also said that they needed to ratify another protocol to its safeguard agreement, so they added another measure onto that. And again, demanded that they fully cooperate with the IAEA's investigation, which they failed to do previously. And Iran just straight up declined. They said no, and announced that they had, for the first time, enriched uranium. And, I mean, this was clearly flying in the face of their original agreement, which Iran violated. And then Iran, being indignant at the response to their violation, decided to double down, and this resulted in further sanctions on them by the United Nations. It's not sanctions that we put on them. It's not the United States. Several countries, right? China, France, Germany, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So it's important to remember that even Russia said, okay, no, you guys got to chill out with this.
Yeah, you're making it look bad.
Yeah.
That having been said, they were supposed to be restricted from such technology from the get-go. So the past agreements just simply didn't work. And in fact, Iran was able to achieve their objective in achieving nuclear technology, enriching uranium, despite the agreements that we had already made. And so it's an important distinction to make, because it's not just that we found them attempting to break the agreement that they had with us, but that they were successful but in their attempt to not only break their agreements, but also to reach their ultimate goals that these agreements were designed to prevent.
And then they announced that they broke the agreement. It would be one thing if we had our intelligence community investigate and discover it, but Iran straight up said themselves, we have enriched uranium.
Yeah, so I mean, what does that tell you? Essentially, they have no sense of remorse or wrongdoing for that action. There's a sense that they cannot be touched. And that's something that was carried out through the Obama administration as well, that Iran was able to keep this mentality that they were untouchable, that they wouldn't be affected by, well, not even that they wouldn't be affected by what the United States would do or that other countries would do, but that it would not comply and that the rest of the world wouldn't do anything about it. That was the mentality that was kind of depicted by the actions of Iranian leaders.
Yes. And we'll get into that more later, because that is actually a very important point that you bring up. But continuing with the timeline, right, so now we're in 2007, and the UN has adopted a new resolution in response to Iran's continued failure to comply with the Council's demands to halt uranium enrichment. Then, following 3 rounds of talks, Iran agreed on a plan for Iran to answer long-standing questions about its nuclear activities, including work suspected of being related to the development of nuclear weapons. Then the United States publicly released an unclassified summary of a new National Intelligence Estimate report on Iran's nuclear program, saying that the intelligence community judged with high confidence that Iran halted its nuclear weapons program in 2003, and assessed with moderate confidence that the program had not resumed, but defined Iran's nuclear weapons program as design and weaponization work, as well as clandestine uranium conversion and enrichment, predicting that Iran would be able to produce highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon between 2010 and 2015.
Now, for those of you who are not aware of the word clandestine, essentially this means that they were doing so secretively, and that everything that we had mentioned prior about this, in stating that there was a need to prevent Iran from being able to reach nuclear proliferation, that was the purpose of all of these agreements in the first place, and that Iran was clearly spitting in the face of those agreements this entire time. That sentiment was confirmed by this unclassified summary from our intelligence organizations, and furthermore, now we are guaranteed at this point that Iran is on its way to producing nuclear weapons.
Yes. And their prediction was that they would be able to produce highly enriched uranium by 2010 and 2015. We are now 5 to 10 years beyond that. We are in 2020. And, who knows really how close the Iranians are to having nuclear weapons.
I want to also point out something further, that the estimation that this would be a capability they would reach by 2010 or 2015 is also taking into account the relationship that they've had with the rest of the world, and the fact that the rest of the world is trying their best to make sure, or at least trying
at this point, yes, in time,
at that point in time, to prevent the nuclear arms prevent nuclear weaponization from
yes.
Iran.
Yeah.
And so with all of that pressure from the rest of the world trying to make sure this didn't happen, we still believe that would have been the case by 2010, 2015, which is essentially our way of saying this is probably going to find its way through. Their nuclear weapons are going to find a way to leak through whether we like it or not, which is in itself a dooming and dangerous sentiment.
Yeah. And this was already with many sanctions placed on Iran. I mean,
and this is all going to tie back into Soleimani and our current relationship with Iran as well.
Yes,
because
it's important to really go through this to understand the line that we walked in order to get here. Because it's easy to, look at the recent events and forget what brought us to this point. And this will become clear after I make this next point. So I'm going to read this, and then I'll continue with my thought. So now we're in 2008. The UN Security Council passed another resolution broadening sanctions on Iran and required increased efforts on the part of member states to prevent Iran from acquiring sensitive nuclear or missile technology, and added 13 people and 7 entities to the UN blacklist. Following this, a new proposal was offered to Iran in which the UN Security Council would agree to not impose further sanctions if Iran agreed to halt any expansion of its enrichment activities.
Expansion of its enrichment activities.
Yes.
Meaning they can continue those activities, but that they can't, for example, build infrastructure to continue those activities further. So all of their current infrastructure to do so was fair game, so to speak.
Yes, and that proposal was outright denied, by the way. And this trend
was that denied by the UN or by
Iran? By Iran.
So they were given the opportunity to continue doing what they were doing essentially, and yet denied that proposition because it wasn't enough.
Yes.
Because they wanted to pursue those technologies and that type of thing faster.
And so this was in 2008, and the trend of the UN pursuing agreements with Iran and then Iran rejecting them or accepting them and then violating them, as we've seen before for years now. Iran agrees. They say we're not going to enrich uranium. They enrich uranium. Sanctions are put on them. And then they get indignant over sanctions being put on them, and they continue. And this keeps happening for years. And that's why I wanted to read that off before I continued with the point I was making moments ago of how we got here. Iran has been constantly breaking their word, constantly going back on agreements, and constantly spitting in the face of the international community that has tried to offer them a way out if they would simply stop the pursuit of missile technology and nuclear weapons. And every single time they have refused. And so now, and we're here, there are still more recent events you need to understand in order to understand how exactly we got to the point now where we killed Soleimani. Yeah, and we're going to talk about those, but you need to understand before we do that Iran is not they are not a state that acts in good faith. They are not a state on which we can take their word on things.
Right, and that having been said, understanding that they had been backing terrorist groups since 1986, we've understood that this has been a threat for a long time, or at least our intelligence communities have. Our government has acted in such a manner, but many people today seem to totally forget that. In fact, a lot of what I hear from people, many things that I've seen on Twitter, on other social media sites, is that this is something equating to our invasion of Iraq,
or that it's the U.S.'s fault for putting sanctions on them, and that's why Iran is acting the way that they are. And there may be some truth to that statement, but it's not entirely true. Like, yes, Iran is acting out because of our sanctions, but we put sanctions on them because they were violating international law and agreements that they agreed to.
Right. I mean,
and because they were engaging in terrorism.
If you put a murderer in jail for 10 years and then they got out and did it again, they wouldn't exactly be able to blame the government for jailing them, right? And you would never entertain the argument that, oh, this person carried out such a behavior because they were jailed. You would never make such an argument.
And yet, there are people in our country who are arguing that Iran's actions are our fault. Essentially, victim blaming, if you will.
Well, yeah, and I mean, another part of that is also that people have this perception that the United States is immune no matter what happens, and that we have all of the control and all of the negotiating power. And while I will say that the United States has substantive negotiating power in many contexts and has a lot of power to defend itself, it's not immune. And we don't have all the negotiating power in the world, and we can't force other countries to do things. We can't force Iran.
I mean, clearly, we've been putting sanctions on sanctions on sanctions on Iran, and they still keep on violating every single agreement that we propose to them.
And yet the perception is that when the United States does something to essentially punish Iran for continually breaking its agreements and continuing its nuclear proliferation, that's the U.S.'s fault. But that's not the case. Clearly, it's not the case, and that idea is also contingent on the idea that the rest of the world has no power over what they do, that Iran has no power over the decisions that it makes, and that it's all the U.S.'s fault for every decision that Iran has made. And so it's a way of absolving Iran of any responsibility and wrongdoing.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, frankly, it's ridiculous. You can't take the agency away from people. And I mean, this is something that a bit of a theme that I've seen a lot of, people failing to take responsibility of themselves, but also people failing to recognize where responsibility lies. Clearly, the actions of Iran fall on their leaders, like Soleimani.
It has an air of collectivist mentality, doesn't it?
Yes.
The idea that it's not the actors that are at fault, but rather their status in conjunction with because the U.S. is the strongest power in the world. Everything is the U.S.'s fault. That's something that is quite literally echoed through Marxist mentality.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, though. I mean, there are lots of Marxists who want to see the U.S. fall because they blame it for all of the world's ills, despite the fact that we are the freest nation in the world, despite the fact that our mere existence make other nations freer, despite the fact that we are the most prosperous nation of the world and our very existence makes other nations more prosperous, despite the fact that because we have the most powerful military in the world, we make other nations safer. Other nations who don't have much of a military of their own to speak of, we are their line of defense.
Right.
Our soldiers are the ones who go to fight and die for them. And yet, when we punish a nation like Iran, who sponsors terrorism, who has committed heinous acts, who agrees to and violates international agreements, when we punish them for all of these things, then we are the bad guys and we are responsible for the terrorism that they have actually done themselves.
Right. And, I mean, we can also see this sentiment echoed when you can hear, for one example that probably is less familiar to people, you wouldn't blame a teacher for every action of every student at all times. Those students are individuals, right? That seems straightforward enough. And yet people are totally comfortable blaming one administration or another for the doings of everything that happens within a country. And it's laughable because the entire basis of our political system and how our country functions is that one person doesn't have all the power. And that's the way we want it, and that's the way it should be. And yet you'll constantly hear that, well, this is Trump's fault, or this is that, every other thing. And the same thing is true regarding the Obama administration. I mean, it's an administration. There are other people other than him. But I suppose I think I've proven my point in the regard that the world is, many actors in the world view the United States as the only relevant power. And even many Americans view this to be the case. And so when we have an instance where we, for example, kill Soleimani, someone who's responsible for various, insurgency groups, essentially militia groups, training them on how to build bombs and IEDs and other things, that this is somehow the fault of the United States because we have the power. When the reality of the situation is we don't have all the power, and if we did have all the power, then we'd be the bad guy. And that there's no good way for one entity to have.
Guy. These things are sort of cyclical.
Yes.
Right? They believe that we have all the power, and therefore we are the bad guy.
Right. And so the reality is that neither one of those things is actually true. We don't have all the power. We don't have all the responsibility. And while the U.S. does make mistakes, we're not always the bad guy. And we do have to act in accordance to our own safety. That's another thing people totally forget about this whole circumstance, too. A U.S. embassy was attacked. Americans could have been killed in this.
Yes. I believe one was.
And one was. And the idea that the United States is just immune to attack is one of those incredibly egotistic
look at
concepts.
9/11. Before 9/11, people believed we were immune to attack, and then we were attacked. And who's to say that we won't be attacked again? I mean, yes, our military is very powerful, and since then we've become much better and much more vigilant at defending ourselves, but that doesn't mean that there aren't threats that we have to deal with.
Another thing I can also point out about this is that contingent within the whole concept of war, like one of the root concepts of war is that you will experience loss. Losses that you can account for and losses that you can't, and losses that are, for lack of a better phrase, unneeded, I suppose. I mean, it's one of the realities of war is that you'll see casualties in places that you would hope to do everything to prevent and not see those casualties. But
war is messy and unpredictable.
The idea of civilian casualties is one of those examples that no matter how particular a nation is about the way that it carries out a war, that civilian casualties are almost inevitable. And of course,
especially when you deal with an enemy who is willing to use women and children as human shields.
Quite literally willing to do so. And I mean literally as meat shields. Yeah. And so, but that having been said, yes, then the United States may be able to win any war that it is in, potentially. And that's something we can view in theory to be true. But that doesn't mean that the United States won't experience significant losses and that each loss of life is not a significant loss. And one of the great things about this nation is that we value each individual as important outside of its collective. You know.
Absolutely. And,
so we do have to keep in mind that while some of these Iranians may be mourning the death of Soleimani, we should be mourning the death of a U.S. contractor killed by such actions. We should be mourning that death.
Yes. So let's continue down the timeline now, because we went over Iran's constant violations of agreements, and
so this brings us to 2015.
Yes, and now we get to the infamous Iran nuclear deal that was crafted under the Obama administration, and it was passed, lifting sanctions on Iran in exchange for Iran's compliance with limits on examinations of their nuclear program, and then the United States raised Iran's ballistic missile tests as a possible violation of the UN Security Council's resolution, and Iran tested another medium-range ballistic missile a month later. So we passed the Iran nuclear deal. We lift the sanctions on Iran in exchange for their compliance. And not too much longer after that, Iran begins ballistic missile tests, which is in direct violation of a resolution that was passed by the UN
months later,
that they were not supposed to do this.
Months later.
Yes.
So, I mean, a total failure on the part of the Obama administration that, for whatever reason, decided to ignore history and consider that, maybe we can trust them this time. I mean, fool me once, shame on you, but fool me 5 or 6 times, I should be pretty ashamed by now.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the thing that should be noted. Technically, Iran's ballistic missile testing are not in violation of the nuclear agreement itself, of the nuclear deal. They're in violation of something else, but that should be a clear red flag, if all of their other previous violations weren't, that while they are in the process of coming to this nuclear deal with us, they are violating proposals that they are not supposed to be testing ballistic missiles that they, should they acquire the ability to produce nuclear warheads, could put on their missiles and then use against other nations.
I want to sprinkle this in here as well. One of the main deterring factors for nuclear war is that no country wants to be nuked. Every country is acting in self-preservation, and this is something that we can reflect with the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. Now, there's one exception to that, and it is when we talk about things like martyrdom. And one example of that I can pull from history.
I'm glad you brought up the Cold War, because
right.
Fidel Castro, the former dictator of Cuba, said himself that he was willing to sacrifice Cuba. He was willing to allow Cuba to be completely destroyed in nuclear war if it meant the destruction of the United States. And to my knowledge, Fidel Castro was not a particularly religious man. He was very zealous in his revolutionary ideas.
Keeping in mind, within the manifesto of the communist is the concept that there is no religion is something that is normally attacked very, very quickly by the communists.
Well, yes, because
we've seen that depicted in Russia and in China, for example. But one of those reasons being
they need to implement their own ideology as the effective religion.
Right. I mean, you're not allowed to have a god in, for example, communist China, because Mao is the god. And in many places, to this day, he is still revered as a god who has a photo that is refurbished every year to maintain his image. That's to this day.
Yeah.
And that having been said, throughout history, we have seen some cultures that have been more, who have valued the idea of martyrdom more than others, and we are definitely seeing that within
a country like Iran.
In a country like Iran, and particularly within terroristic groups that are willing to do things like suicide bomb or use their wives or children as human shields. And so the reason I bring this up is because that main deterring factor of don't nuke us or you might get nuked is not going to be a deterrence to
a country that doesn't mind being nuked.
Well, a nation and a culture that values martyrdom with such high regard might actually see it as the. I mean, so
it actually might be an enticement.
It's an enticing thing.
Nuclear war.
Castro not only was willing to let Cuba be absolutely decimated by nuclear war, but also valued and in many ways looked forward to the idea that the sacrifice of Cuba could be the
thing that brings on the communist utopia.
Right, and that was something he took great pride in. And that is something that we're definitely seeing represented through this as well.
Yeah, so
if Iran does get a nuclear weapon,
it's much more dangerous than many other nations.
Don't know. Right, but if Iran does achieve nuclear missile technology, and particularly things like ICBMs, where they're going to be able to send a nuclear weapon at a long distance, which, by the way, is why the mid-range ballistic missile issue is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Who's to say that they won't, for example, nuke Israel?
Yeah, and by the way, I should mention that medium-range ballistic missiles are something that even the United States and Russia agreed not to produce in the intermediate nuclear. I forget the exact name of it, but I believe under Nixon and Gorbachev, we came to an agreement. And now, by the way, that agreement was recently, not too recently, but I think about a year or so ago, was reneged on because Russia was violating that agreement as well, producing their own medium-range ballistic missiles. But even our country agreed not to produce these missiles, and then here is Iran doing the exact same thing. So it'd be one thing, right? Like, we have nuclear energy. It's, Iran may want to pursue nuclear energy. That's one thing. But even we do not produce medium-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. Well, not intercontinental ballistic missiles. If they're intercontinental, they wouldn't be medium-range. But even we don't produce those, and here is Iran completely violating a law that even our country is in accordance with.
Right. I mean, while Iran is vehemently pursuing nuclear weapons technology, during the Obama administration, we actually dismantled our largest nuclear bomb.
Mm-hmm.
Just to give a idea of the direction that we're heading in as nations. So Iran is definitely looking to achieve nuclear weapons technology. They've been well on the path to do so. And by the way, this Iran nuclear deal that we're speaking of is in 2015, which is the later span of when our intelligence community predicted that they would already have nuclear weapons technology. So now we can already be somewhat confident that they have nuclear weapons technology, that the pressures from foreign bodies have been ineffective as they have been throughout history, and that any claims that Iran is making that they are not pursuing such technologies are likely false, and that they have given us multiple false claims before. And now here we are in 2015 trying to strike a deal with them, and at the same time, only months after this resolution, we're looking at them testing mid-range ballistic missiles. So what does that tell you? I mean, essentially what you can assert from that is that they already have or may already have nuclear weapons technology, and if not, they may be very close.
Yeah.
And that they are very close to reaching the capability, and this is in 2015, they're very close to reaching the capability to, for example, start a nuclear war.
Yes. And now continuing, because there is more to this, and we're now in 2016 in the timeline, and the IAEA, they verified that Iran has met its nuclear-related commitments, triggering the lifting of sanctions. So, okay, we get the nuclear deal, and Iran finally says, okay, we'll comply, we'll allow you to investigate, and the IAEA confirms, which is surprising given Iran's previous behavior. So we'll give them that. However, in the IAEA's first quarterly report, they noted that Iran had slightly exceeded a 130 metric ton cap set on the stockpile of heavy water allowed under the agreement, and a month later Iran test-launched 2 variations of the Qadr medium-ranged ballistic missile, raising concerns of inconsistency with the UN Security Council's resolutions. So they're complying, but they slightly exceed one of the measures that they have to comply with, and they continue to violate the resolution against medium ballistic missiles. So
oddly enough, this is actually the best news that we've had on this in the entirety of the history that we've actually depicted so far. This is the best. This is the best it's been. This is the most that they've been honest with us since we began this conversation and dug through the history. And by the way, the heavy water reference there essentially refers to nuclear energy's technology, and the fact that they wouldn't be willing to comply with the mid-range ballistic missile technology restrictions that we had imposed, again, are just telling even farther to exactly what we just said. By the way, that was QADR, not the country Qatar. So just to give that reference. And now we're in 2017 on the timeline.
Yeah, and just a quick point about this. Despite the fact that the IAEA said that they complied, they're still walking that line of compliance, right, where they are still they're just barely going over the cap. And after this, they did go back under the cap to comply because they really didn't want us to put further sanctions on them. I think that at this point they knew that they finally had something that they could at least wiggle out of the sanctions, because the sanctions had been lifted. They want to maintain that while still complying with the nuclear agreement, but then violating other agreements that weren't the nuclear agreement. And the reason that they were now violating these other agreements is they said, okay, well, you're going to lift the sanctions on us if we just agree with these few things. We'll agree with those, and then we'll just do whatever we want over here in violation of these other things that aren't a part of that.
Right. I mean, it's a clear strategic move. And then, so I'm going to read this one off here. 2017.
Go ahead.
Iran tests another medium-range ballistic missile in defiance of the UN's Security Council resolution, prompting Michael Flynn to declare that the United States has placed Iran on notice. Senator Bob Corker, a Republican from Tennessee, introduced a new Iran sanctions bill targeting Iran's ballistic missile program and support for terrorism. The Trump administration acknowledges Iran's compliance with the nuclear agreement and renews sanctions waivers, but in issues non-nuclear sanctions on Iran. So we're still talking about those ballistic missiles.
And this is important to note because, okay, Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal, but they're violating the UN Security Council's resolution against medium ballistic missiles, and they are still a state sponsor of terrorism, which hasn't changed since 1984.
And by the way, I also want to add into this that their compliance with this does not mean that they're not pursuing nuclear weapons technology. It just means that they're not building into new infrastructure.
Right. And so, but this is important because, okay, well, we're not issuing sanctions against them because of the nuclear deal, and we're not even sanctioning their nuclear capabilities. These sanctions were specifically because of their violations of the resolution against medium-range ballistic missiles and because of their sponsoring of terrorism. So people criticized Trump for this. They said this is a violation of the Iran deal. And yes, Trump did speak out vehemently against the Iran deal, and fair enough. I happen to agree that it was a bad deal, but he didn't violate it, and in fact renewed the waivers on the sanctions, keeping the sanctions off of Iran because of their compliance, and instead implemented new sanctions because, again, of their violation, their consistent violation of the resolution against ballistic missiles. So, and this makes perfect sense because, okay, you guys aren't violating our nuclear deal. That's fine. We won't renew the sanctions that against your nuclear program. But you guys are still doing all of this other stuff, and we can't just allow that, right? Like you're being good in this one specific instance, and you're still breaking all of these other rules. So are we just supposed to ignore that? I don't think so.
Right. So you can essentially view that as him plugging up the leaks. In many ways that Iran was using to essentially manipulate policy and strategically continue to move forward towards nuclear proliferation.
Yes.
Now, in 2018, Trump administration reissues waivers on nuclear-related sanctions against Iran, but Trump says he will not reissue them unless Congress passes legislation addressing what he describes as flaws in the agreement, flaws that we've just pointed out here. Trump also states that his administration is engaging with European allies on a supplemental agreement that would impose sanctions if Iran tests long-range missiles, thwarts inspections, or makes progress towards a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. So I think that, along the same lines of what I just discussed, these are all reasonable.
Plugging up those gaps, trying to make sure that there isn't a loophole to the purpose of our sanctions and the purpose of this agreement in the first place, which is to prevent nuclear proliferation. And in many regard, that can be viewed as something that was semi-successful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
and like yet Trump was widely criticized for this, however.
And while Iran may not comply with the agreements that we do make with them, that is at least a more worthy agreement that has fewer flaws, and that anything they do to try to continue their nuclear technology is a direct violation of this. Meanwhile, previously there were loopholes, and so they could continue to meet the agreement that they had with us and continue their nuclear technology and other, or rather continue their path towards nuclear technology in other rights. And this takes us to 2019.
2019, yeah. So, just last year, Iran announced that it would no longer be bound by stockpile limitations on enriched uranium and heavy water reserves. The United States announced new sanctions targeting Iran's industrial metal exports, and European foreign ministers urged Iran to continue to meet its commitments under the JCPOA, which is the nuclear agreement. Then Iran announced that it will quadruple uranium enrichment output and will soon surpass the 300 kilogram limit on uranium gas. Then Iran is accused of attacking 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman, but denies involvement. However, a week later, Iran shot down a U.S. surveillance drone claiming it was in Iranian airspace, which the United States disputed, saying that it was international airspace. So before we continue, let's just talk about this first part a little bit, right? So we say to Iran, listen, you're complying with the nuclear agreement. Okay, fine. We're still lifting the sanctions on you because of that. But you're doing all of these other violations, pursuing ballistic missiles. You can't do that. We're going to put sanctions on you because of that. And Iran says, oh, you're going to sanction us for pursuing ballistic missiles? You're going to sanction us for terrorism? Well, we're just going to renege on the entire nuclear agreement. And people tried to paint this as, oh, Trump pulled out of the nuclear agreement. But he hadn't actually done so. Trump had continued to abide by the nuclear agreement all the way up until this point, and then Iran, getting angry that we're sanctioning them for violating other protocols, they're like, okay, well, fine, we're gonna quadruple our uranium enrichment then. Why not? Because we're in the position where we don't really need this anymore. We've already progressed to the point where we can just keep on doing it.
Essentially, they no longer need to cooperate with us. Not that cooperation with us was ever something they intended to preach or to continue to, but now they have absolutely no reason to even pretend that they are going to try to do so. No reason whatsoever.
Yeah, so, and then the attacks that happened as well, because this is important in the escalation, right? I mean, the attack on our embassy that happened this past week, like that was the onus for the killing of Soleimani. But it's not like this is the first time that Iran has acted out, right? They attacked and seized ships, which actually ended up resulting in the United Kingdom's Navy getting involved. They shot down one of our drones. That was a big moment that a lot of people thought was going. Yeah, and people thought that was going to start World War III. I mean, just several months ago, and it didn't. But Iran has been constantly. They've been pushing the limit to see what they can get away with.
And keeping in mind, this is exactly like what we had mentioned before regarding how the world views this as an American issue. They view this as a situation in which, because we have the biggest military, that we're at fault regardless of what happens. And Iran has totally manipulated that perspective and is using it to their fullest advantage. And And so this kind of takes us into some further actions.
So then after the U.S. drone was shot down, the United States sanctioned the supreme leader of Iran himself and his office. And after further sanctions, the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani announced that all commitments for research and development under the JCPOA would be removed. So they said they were going to quadruple their uranium enrichment, and they were going to do other things as well. But there were still some small instances in which they were like, all right, we'll kind of comply with the rules. But after the U.S. drone is shot down and we sanctioned them because they shot down our drone, then they're like, okay, well, now all bets are off. We're not going to abide by this thing whatsoever. And so then a drone and cruise missile strike damaged a Saudi Arabian oil company facility, and U.S. intelligence findings implicated Iran in the attack. And so, in response, the U.S. deployed additional troops to Saudi Arabia and imposed new sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran, the National Development Fund of Iran, and the Etemad Tijarat Pars Company, an Iranian company that is implicated in concealing the Iranian military's financial transactions.
So yet another instance in which, I mean, I'm beating a dead horse here.
Yeah, I mean,
they said they were going to do something, they lied about it.
Yeah, and I mean, this has been the story for decades. Like,
literal decades.
If you've been paying close attention from the beginning, when we started this podcast, they agree to something, they go back on the agreement, and we offer them a proposal. They either agree to it and then renege on it again, or they outright say, no, we're not going to agree, and continue violations. I mean, they can absolutely cannot be trusted in regards to anything. And even when they complied with the nuclear agreement, continued to violate other provisions, other resolutions. We punished them for that, and then they got mad because they were punished for breaking international laws that they agreed to, and decided that they were going to break the only thing they ever complied with in the first place.
Yeah, and so then continuing here.
Yeah, and so as a result of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany condemned Iran for the attack, and President Rouhani announced that Iran will not engage in negotiations while under sanctions, but the three European nations warned that a fourth violation of the JCPOA will prompt a special dispute mechanism. So this is important because the UK, France, and Germany, they were constantly urging Iran to continue compliance, and they were also urging Trump not to put sanctions on Iran, even though our sanctions on them had nothing to do with their nuclear program and were justified, as we've discussed.
But these specific was regarding their ballistic missiles.
Yes.
And other things.
Yes, but even with that, the UK, France, and Germany, they were still trying to work with Iran. And at this point now that once Iran launched these missiles against Saudi Arabia and things started to escalate, especially when the UK Navy had to get involved, now Europe is finally saying, listen, Iran, you guys need to calm down. And Iran says, no.
Now it's the time to put your foot down.
Yeah.
Like now the all-wise European powers decide that now is the time to start caring about all of this.
Yeah,
despite the fact that they've already pretty much achieved their objectives to a lesser degree.
Yeah, and Iran's response is basically, well, we're not going to negotiate as long as there are sanctions. But the sanctions are our negotiating leverage. If we remove our sanctions for you to negotiate with us, what is the point of negotiation? We just give you everything you want. That's not a negotiation.
Yeah.
And if Iran chooses to follow that strategy, which it appears that they have, it makes perfect sense why they would continue to lash out, because what Iran is trying to do is continue attacking targets and trying to get us to lift sanctions on them to get them to stop. But that would not be a good move by us, because it would be us rewarding their behavior of attacking. It would be a
Be like throwing eggs at your teacher so she doesn't throw you into contention.
Yeah. And not only that, but it's
one analogy I can kind of.
It would be effectively like to reference World War II, like appeasing Hitler. Right? I mean, you can't just give Hitler what he wants. I mean, he takes Poland. Before that, he takes Czechoslovakia. He takes these territories, and then you say, okay, Hitler, we'll give you what you want if you stop. That doesn't work like that. You just embolden them to further attack because now you have taught them that attacking will bring them rewards. It'll give them what they want. That is something that we cannot do.
And furthermore, I mean, it gives them a range for how far they're able to push that envelope. So, for example, if they're able to do something like this, if they had done all of this that we're discussing, if Iran had tried to do all this within the span of maybe 5 or 10 years, it probably would have already resulted in a war. But they didn't. They did it slowly, and essentially they pushed the envelope further and further, but kind of waited a little while for things to cool down, and then pushed the envelope further and waited for things to cool down. And it's essentially how that, like you said, appeasement works. We don't want to be the escalating party. We don't want to be the ones to fire the first shot, so to speak. And so every time we get, every time Iran violates their agreements, attacks Americans in one way, shape, or form, because like we said before, Iran is involved with 3 proxy wars with the United States where they're backing terroristic groups. The idea is just for them to wait until we look like the bad guy because we have to put our foot down.
And then the only real measures we've taken against them have been economic sanctions. We've been sanctioning them and sanctioning them and sanctioning them in the hopes that it'll get them to stop, and it hasn't worked. It's only emboldened them because they understand, well, you're not going to take military action against us. Because like you said, nobody wants to be the one to take the first shot. We don't want to be the one to take the first shot. They clearly have no issue with this as they are launching missiles, attacking ships, shooting down drones. They're going to keep on attacking as they attacked our embassy. They think that we will continue to allow them to do that, and all we'll put on them is economic sanctions. And sure, the sanctions hurt, but they clearly don't care about them. It hasn't stopped them from doing anything. And so now they finally go too far in 2020, just this past week. They attack our embassy in Iraq. Soleimani, directly responsible for that, arming and training the militias that did so. And Trump finally says no and kills Soleimani.
Yeah, the second most powerful person in Iran. And honestly, and this is my opinion, but hell, good riddance. Glad the guy's dead. Very glad the guy's dead. America's a safer place for it. Iraq is a safer place for it. And speaking of which, this actually resulted in great pressures on Iraq. And so we have a circumstance in which the former Prime Minister, Adel Abdul Mahdi, called on Parliament to suspend foreign forces from being able to remain in Iraq. He's not an official position, okay, but he is still an influential...
He's a relevant leader.
He's very relevant, yes, and he's influential to the government, kind of much in the way that, for example, Obama could still be influential to the United States if he chose to be, but is not. And that having been said, had he chosen to be, it would probably be seen as some type of major violation of...
norms, at the very least.
Well, it would be seen as some type of assertion of power that is beyond what a sitting president should be allowed, or a former president would be allowed to do. So something like this, in some way, almost circumvents the political establishment of Iraq. But so continuing, lawmakers did decide to do just this, and
in Iraq,
and basically push out any foreign forces that were in Iraq at the time. However, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, responded to this, stating that Mahdi is under enormous, quote, under enormous threats from the very Iranian leadership that it is that we are pushing back against. Another quote here, we are confident that the Iraqi people want the U.S. to continue to be there to fight the counterterrorism campaign. Also stating, and we will continue to do all the things we need to do to keep America safe. So there's a little bit of a back and forth here in the regard that Mike Pompeo does not want to leave Iraq, and quite frankly, there are some very good reasons for that. When we pulled out of Iraq during the Obama administration, we erased.
We basically left it open for ISIS.
Right. Not even. Yeah, literally. We literally did exactly that. Exactly that. Iraqi forces were not nearly strong enough. Conventional Iraqi forces were not nearly strong enough to be able to reinstate any form of order or government. And as a result, many of the hard-fought battles the United States was part of, I kind of hate to say this, but were for nothing. And I don't want to say
and
that.
A lot of members of our military were very disappointed in Obama's decision to do so, because they fought and their fellow men and women in the armed forces died in order to defeat this enemy. And I mean, the Iraqis, by all accounts, loved us for it.
They wanted us there. We were providing aid in the form of money, training. We were still involved with the training of conventional Iraqi military forces so that they can be built up to a stronger place, so that they're able to fight ISIS and fight other terroristic groups that the Iraqi people hate. They're terrorized by this more than we are.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's right in their home.
It's right in their home. They literally have their homes taken by this. They have their children, their women directly affected by this.
Civilians who assisted the United States military against the terrorists, when we pulled out, those people were simply killed by the ISIS and terrorist insurgents who came right back in after we left.
I'd like to cite one specific region in the Battle of Ramadi as a good example of this. U.S. intelligence and many foreign intelligence bodies were very, very confident that it would be impossible for U.S. forces and conventional forces to be able to recapture that city and rid it of insurgent forces that were dominating the area, literally dominating the area. And that having been said, the U.S. fought incredibly hard and with great casualties to not only recapture Ramadi, but also to be able to do so in a manner that was safe for the civilian population there.
Right.
And it's one of those things, I mean, you can't just fix every conflict with bombs. When you do so, you take a high risk of civilian casualties in situations like this. And so we sent in, personnel. The Army Corps of Engineers was working to literally rebuild and reinforce torn down buildings while they were being shot at by Taliban forces. We experienced incredibly high casualties, and we're successful despite all of the odds and all of the...
We're successful in taking an area that was deemed as impossible to capture.
Impossible.
And we did it.
Deemed by the most well-read people on the topic to be impossible. And quite frankly, one of the most dangerous cities in the world, Ramadi.
And a large portion of the civilians there assisted our armed forces in doing so. And we were able to secure the region. And then, as we discussed earlier,
just as Ed mentioned,
Obama pulls our troops out. The troops leave Ramadi. Ramadi is recaptured. Ramadi's recaptured by ISIS, and all of the civilians that lived there were murdered by them.
Right. All of the civilians, specifically to clarify that the civilians that aided the United States, over 300 families, killed overnight.
Yeah.
Immediately by ISIS and by insurgent forces. So the Iraqi people wanted us there. There was, you can, one person who's kind of in a more famous light that you can look into it and hear him speak about this, Jocko Willink, who's a former Navy SEAL who was a task force, I believe he was a task force commander during the Battle of Ramadi and was there and experienced casualties within his team. Literally said that as they would kill insurgent forces, civilians would cheer. That there were civilians who would be cheering in the streets as they killed insurgent forces.
Just as there were Iraqis cheering at the death of Soleimani.
Yes. I mean, there's popular video online right now of people marching in the streets in celebration and dancing in the streets in celebration of the death of Soleimani. And when we pulled out of Iraq, the civilian population in many ways felt betrayed, because here we did all of this to try to protect a civilian population. The civilian population risked everything to be able to help us in return at great personal risks, because mind you, we have guns in the military. The civilians had nothing to defend themselves with and had to go out on a limb and take a leap of faith to say, you know what, we'll support these Americans because maybe that will help us in the long run, and maybe that's the right thing to do. They did exactly that. We left. There's video, I believe, of Iraqi civilians throwing stones at shoes at U.S. Military personnel vehicles as we left, because they were upset and crying.
Because they wanted us there.
Crying
because
and
they
asking
needed
us to stay. Yeah,
and that's the thing about these wars. Nobody wants to go to war, but sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah.
And when we go to war in a place like Iraq, when we go there, and especially when we are working alongside these people, once we're there, you can't simply just pull out. It's only going to create more chaos. Commitment. Yes.
War is the ultimate form of, you can get married and you can get divorced, but there is no partial commitment possible when it comes to war.
And unfortunately, because of the political forces in our nation, this is an occurrence that is all too common. I mean, the same thing happened in Vietnam, which a controversial war to be sure, but we were on the verge of winning that war. Like, we were actually very close to completely defeating the North Vietnamese army, and then because of the political tension within our own nation, we pulled back our troops and the communist regime took over. You see the same thing happening in the Middle East now, with us going in, toppling these dictators and these terrorist regimes, saving people who praised us for coming in and saving them, people who worked alongside us and fought alongside us, and now we are seeing the exact same political movements within our nation right now that want us to simply pull out and leave the people who fought alongside us at the mercy of tyrants, at the mercy of people like Soleimani, who would see them all dead and would see us all dead. If Soleimani could kill every American citizen, he would do so, and yet there are Americans right now who are mourning his death.
As we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we have, great skepticism from 2020 Democrats as to why this happened and whether or not this is necessary. But furthermore, we have people in Canada literally, publicly mourning in mass for the death of Soleimani and calling him a martyr and a hero. So with something like a war, you have to be willing to not only defeat the immediate enemy and the immediate threat, but then also to be able to build diplomatic relationships with the remaining forces, so that you can build a country to the point where it can successfully maintain itself, and furthermore, that it can do so in a manner that we can respect and abide by and acknowledge as the right way to do things.
And this exact thing that you're talking about, this idea of nation building, is a strategy that has come to be widely criticized by political movements today. And I think that it's because people don't really understand why or how it works. And
it's called imperialist. They call it an imperialist thing.
They do, but it's not. It's not as though we are simply conquering and annexing these nations. I mean, here's the thing that you need to realize. We've done this before. In World War II, when we defeated Japan, when we defeated Germany, we stayed there. We built up the nation. We built relations with them, and then we left. But we remained in some of these nations for 70 years before we left to ensure their stability. And we haven't been in the Middle East for nearly as long. If we actually, and sure, 70 years is a big commitment. I'm sure there are lots of valid criticisms, right, in terms of resource allocation, how much money we're spending. That's all well and good. But the fact of the matter is that if we pull out prematurely, then we will simply have to deal with this problem all over again.
Which we're experiencing right now in Iraq. And by the way, while I agree to the sentiment that there may be a great financial burden on the nation to do so, I would also just slip in the counter argument just to the popular perspective that we may actually benefit more from the diplomatic relationships and also the economic opportunities we build within such countries that benefit the United States.
I agree, but there is, I think that what we need to do, and this is a problem that we as a country have had for a while, in that we don't get enough of a commitment from our allies in assisting us in doing these things. And unfortunately, many countries
busy giving everything away for free.
Yeah, well, many countries in the world that rely on us for doing exactly what we're talking about doing, right? I mean, rely on us economically, militarily, and even, people like to talk about how lots of other countries have better healthcare systems than us. They don't, and their healthcare systems are entirely reliant on ours.
That's a whole podcast for another segment.
Yeah, we can do that, right? I'm not going to go deeply into this, but the point is that there are all of these nations that rely on us for so many things, and yet they don't assist us in these tasks that affect them too, right? People, they don't really see it that way because they take a very hands-off approach. We're the ones who are directly involved. And
again, that perception...
And that's why the burden falls on us.
Exactly. And again, that perception that the U.S. it's got all the money and it's got all the military power, so it can do it all, and it's got the responsibility to do it all. I mean, but damned if we do and damned if we don't, right? Yeah. I mean, we didn't involve ourselves in the Rwandan genocide and took huge criticism for that. And then we did involve ourselves in Saddam Hussein murdering his own people using chemical weapons, and invading Kuwait, and then we're criticized for that too. We don't involve ourselves in the Syrian conflict the way that we could have, and then we're criticized for that because we didn't do enough.
And then we get involved.
And then we're criticized again for it by the same people.
There's no winning, because I think fundamentally there is a large portion of people who hate the United States. And look, you can criticize our country. Sure, we've made mistakes. Look at any country's history. No country's history is perfect. But name one country that has done more good in the world than the United States. There is none.
I can't think of any.
There is none.
We rebuilt Europe and most of a good chunk of the world after World War II. We've provided military aid and training to numerous nations. We've involved ourselves in conflicts that directly resulted in the preservation of thousands, perhaps millions of foreign lives. The list can go on. I do believe this is the greatest country in the world, and I don't think that's just an emotional argument. I can put that on paper.
I think it's a fact.
I think it is a fact. I can put it on paper. That having been said, regarding the current circumstances with Iraq and with Iran, it seems that the Iraqi government is facing serious pressure that if they continue to allow U.S. forces to remain, that they may see some type of repercussions from the Iranians.
Yeah, well,
and that could be a further incitation of war.
Well, I think that's a good segue into what we should talk about next, which is where do we go from here, right? How might the Iranians respond to this recent attack? Because they have vowed revenge, and despite the fact that they started all of this, they, I believe, feel that their honor has now been besmirched.
Not that they had much to begin with, but their perception of
yes,
it, sure.
Yes, and so now, and this is why people are saying, oh, well, there's going to be a World War III. But here's the thing. There are two ways, or really three ways, but one of them I think is unlikely, and that one is that Iran does nothing, which I don't think that's going to happen. That would make them look too weak. They have to respond. But, so now the two options, right, is they either respond by hitting a soft target or a hard target. If they hit a soft target, the reason that I think this is the most likely, and it's because if they hit a hard target, it would essentially mean that we have to go to war with them, and we would be justified in doing so. And we would have the backing of the international community, which is why I don't think that they're going to do that. And I also don't think it would start a World War III because one of Iran's only allies, I mean, Russia and China are their allies, but really more so Russia. And if the vast majority of the international community is backing us, because we would be justified if Iran hit a hard target in going to war with them, I don't think that countries like Russia or China would oppose that, because that's just far too large a force in order for them to really see any benefit out of doing that.
Furthermore, it would be a commitment I think that neither of those parties would be willing to make for logistical reasons. It would definitely be, it wouldn't be a worthwhile prospect for China or Russia. And then, like you mentioned, we have the support of the international community behind us in this right now. Yes. We have the UK very clearly willing to support us. Canada has supported us on the war against terror. Australia as well. Germany,
India.
Again, a power that we largely contributed to building. Right. Instead, we still have military bases in Germany. We're still aiding them in training their forces. We still aid the UK in training the SAS and other forces.
The UK is probably our closest ally.
Yeah.
So they'll be there with us. I'm sure India would probably aid us as well. And then, of course, there's also Israel and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which are all in the region.
And are directly at risk to a nuclear because of a nuclear Iran as well.
Yeah.
Like we mentioned, the Saudis have received attack from such forces before.
Yeah, recently, as of 2019.
And you mentioned the British tankers there were, right? And so the British Navy had to get involved with that. And so they've
made a lot of enemies. And if they hit a hard target, we'll be justified in going to war with them, and their constant violation of the ballistic missile, resolutions, but also various others, as we discussed at length throughout the podcast.
It may be an Iraq war style conflict in which we're going to have to overthrow a sitting administration, a sitting government. Yeah. And by the way, I just want to add this in there. Soleimani and Iranian forces were recently responsible for the death of over 200 unarmed protesters in Iran.
Yeah.
So while there may be some people in Iran protesting and mourning the death of Soleimani,
there were also there are a lot of people in Iran who hated him too.
Yeah, and many people in Iran who have experienced significant loss as a result of such dictatorial actions.
Yeah. But so
now
continuing, right? Because we talked about
a solution,
we talked about what would happen if they hit a hard target, right? Which I think that's unlikely. What is more likely is that they hit a soft target and then they continue to sort of do the things that they've been doing to try and essentially goad us into overreacting, because they don't want to start the war. They want us to be the ones who start the war so that the global consensus is against us.
Which is the whole reason that they're involved with these proxy wars, because at least that way they're able to absolve themselves of direct responsibility, even though they are directly responsible by any reasonable assessment. They're directly responsible for those forces. I mean, they are backing them and training them and doing the rest of it, but they're able to at least say that their government hasn't done it. We can say that they have.
They are looking for plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability. That's a great way to put that. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And so it looks like we'll continue to see that level of aggression from them. That having been said, a few things. A draft
That's not going to happen.
So
yeah, people have been talking about there being a draft. Draft's not going to happen. We have the biggest, most powerful military in the world.
The most technologically advanced military.
We don't need to draft from a population of people who are mostly completely unprepared for the rigors of war. Like, it's just...
Yeah, and quite frankly, American volunteers, the volunteers that are our armed forces are... Like I said, they're voluntarily willing to answer the call to action, the call to the call of our country. And we are seeing a situation which not only is American freedom being threatened, but also the freedom and safety of many foreign powers, many of our allies as well. And so I definitely don't see this as an unreasonable call for war, I suppose. And of course, anyone with their head on straight will tell you that they want to prevent war. I want to prevent war. I don't want to see war.
No one wants war.
Nobody wants war.
But sometimes it's necessary, especially when you are constantly provoked and attacked by a nation who consistently calls for your destruction. I mean, the Iranians, they don't know much English, but they all know how to chant death to America.
That they do. They do.
At least as
the,
we've gone over,
acting powers that be there.
Yeah, and as we've gone over at length, they have been sponsoring terrorism since the 80s. They have been constantly violating international law for decades. They have no regard for anyone. If there is any justifiable war, it's this one. What have they done to pursue peace? Every olive branch we've offered them has either been smacked away or accepted and broken in half.
And essentially used to as tinder for a fire that they've been mustering for the past 40 years. Every single time we offer them a way to not do the wrong thing, they use it as a way to manipulate us.
Yes.
And so, again, I hope to join our armed forces. And so I just point that out there because I don't want to seem as though this is just a purely hypocritical statement, but that war may be necessary to prevent Iran from using a nuclear weapon to potentially destroy Israel or another country. And there's no light way to say that. No, I can't take that lightly, of course, but that is the circumstance that we're in. That is the circumstance we're in. And if we pretend as though we are not at the risk of danger the way that we are, the way that European powers and American powers did during World War II with Hitler, we will find ourselves in a place where damage has been done that we cannot step back from.
Yeah.
By the way, I just want to also point this out. During World War II, one of those things that we did see was that one of the sanctions that Germany was supposed to abide by was that they wouldn't increase their military to a certain restrictive size, and they totally
there were several. They were supposed to keep their military to a certain size. They weren't supposed to occupy the Sudetenland.
Right.
They constantly pushed these limits, right? And when they occupied the Sudetenland, by the way, Hitler said to his troops that if the Allies showed up and tried to pressure them in the Sudetenland, that they were supposed to retreat immediately. They were not going to engage and defend. But because the Allies did nothing, because they showed no resistance, Hitler simply occupied the Sudetenland.
Right? It's a perfect tactical move.
He walked in. He took Czechoslovakia. No one did anything. Every time we refused to challenge him, to go to war, to do anything, to stop Hitler, it only emboldened him to take more. It wasn't until that he and the Soviets invaded Poland that the Allies finally put their foot down. And even then, they actually didn't come to the aid of Poland.
It was far too late, and they did far too little.
Yeah.
And the Polish people were left fighting a war on two sides with allies that literally stood by as they were decimated.
Yeah, and Neville Chamberlain, right, the famous coward. I mean, no one wants to be remembered as a Neville Chamberlain in history. The man who got Hitler to sign an agreement agreeing that he wouldn't invade Czechoslovakia, went home, waved around his paper as some kind of accomplishment, and then Hitler went ahead and did exactly that. In the same way that we have had Iran agree to countless agreements that they simply reneged on for decades.
Right.
This is, you don't want to be remembered as the kind of person that does that. You don't want to be remembered as a Neville Chamberlain. You want to be remembered as a Winston Churchill, as a man who stands up against the tyrant.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as how this moves forward and the solutions that we're seeing proposed, but also criticized by many, I want to point this out as far as the conclusion to what we can do to move forward. And from where I'm standing, there's really only one option, and it's war. And I really kind of hate saying that.
I think
and I want to justify that statement just a little bit, because it's a heavy statement.
We need a casus belli for war. We need a just reason. I think that war is necessary, but how we get into it, that is also important. Not just for the international optics, if you will, and how Iran responds. Right, that's going to be a big factor, but this is a threat that needs to be dealt with, and that is something that I agree with you on.
Yeah, and I want to point this out too, that we should all truly hope, and God forbid that the reason we have to go to war is because Iran uses a nuclear weapon. That is the worst case scenario. Yeah. And we're seeing an administration that is totally willing to kill its own people. We're seeing a culture and a people that is totally willing to endorse the idea of martyrdom. And we will regret this for as long as our history continues as a nation, if we do not act before a nuclear weapon is used. And if a nuclear weapon is used by Iran, there will be no going back. There will be there's no bright side to that.
Yeah.
It's a war worth winning, but damn, is that a huge cost to pay.
I think that the bright side of this is that, for the most part, the U.S. is still safe. We have very powerful missile deterrence, and we can defend ourselves against these attacks, but our allies are much less safe. And as we've stated before, the U.S. military is essentially the military of the world. The burden does fall on us to protect the world. We might not like that. I personally, I don't think it should be this way, but it is this way.
Right now, that is the case, yes.
Yes, and so it does fall on us to stand up and stand with our allies and encourage our allies to stand with us as well. And this is a threat, not just to us. In fact, this is much less of a threat to us than it is to our allies, and that is all the more reason why our allies should be more than willing to stand with us against them.
I mean, I think that Israel has clearly demonstrated they're willing to stand with us, but also because they are at high risk, and that they have a huge...
They're probably target number one.
They are target number one. And like I said, I mean, the worst case scenario we can imagine is that war starts with Iran making the most powerful, decisive move they could make, which is the use of a nuclear weapon against Israel. And then when that happens, sure, yes, we'll be justified to go to war, and maybe that war will only last a few months.
How many lives do we have to lose before we actually do something about this?
And how will we win that war? Will we win it through the use of a nuclear weapon? Will we have to glass the nation of Iran if that's the case?
And how many other nations will be affected by the radiation that spreads from that?
And not even considering the civilian death toll.
Yeah.
And so this is why the United States sends its troops in rather than just bombing everything it can bomb because of that civilian death toll. And if we don't act
and because
soon,
we care about it, unlike our enemies, we don't want to kill civilians. We don't use them as human shields.
right? And so someone could say, "Oh well, why don't we just sanction them and make sure that they don't build their nuclear weapons?" Because clearly
We've literally been doing that for decades.
Right.
I mean, if that was going to work, you'd think it'd have worked by now.
Yeah, 40 years later. And furthermore, we can't trust any agreement we make with them right now will essentially be laughable. Any agreement that we make, unless we're literally saying that we're allowed to go in and take the nuclear weapons if they have any and halt any nuclear development with the use of force. I can't see any solution that we can propose is practically war. It is practically war. It will require the deployment of troops. It will require the overthrow of the current administration.
As the Iranians and the Iranian president specifically has made clear, they refuse to negotiate at all until we lift sanctions. And we're not going to lift sanctions because that would be rewarding them for their behavior, which is, again, as we stated before, not something we're going to do. So if they refuse to negotiate with us under these terms, what is there left but conflict?
Right. What good is negotiation with a leader that wants your country dead and has lied about every agreement that he's made with you for the past 40 years? There is no diplomatic outcome to this. If there was, I'd love to see it. I'd be totally happy for us to not have to send our troops into a war and potentially risk their lives. But it does not seem that there's any solution other than going in with force.
And the thing about this is that we have a lot of politicians that are running for president, particularly the Democrats. In fact, I think Pete Buttigieg comes to mind, but there are others like him as well who have said, "Oh well, we'll," and they, not just in relation to Iran, but with other nations as well. They say, "Oh, we wouldn't go to war. We would pursue diplomatic strategies to try and work with them." But sometimes diplomacy fails.
Yeah, that's the whole purpose of war. There's no we can't just go up to ISIS and try to produce diplomacy with a group of people willing to rape, murder, torture, etc. At some point you put the criminal behind bars or you put them in the ground. And that is how justice works.
Yeah.
If someone on the street is going around terrorizing and killing people, you don't send in a negotiator.
You don't have a conversation with that
and you
guy.
put them down. Yeah, these people are not looking for conversations. They're looking for the death of America.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that not enough people understand when or why war is necessary, and we have been essentially propagandized into becoming wet blanket pacifists who think that there is never any reason to go to war, that no war is justified, but as we've discussed at length now, that is simply not true. And if we had a nation of people with stronger spirit like we used to, I think that not only would more people understand this, but that we would have a greater collection of politicians that were willing to stand behind the decision to go to war with a nation like Iran. But credit to Trump, he's willing to stand up to the country, but unfortunately, it may hurt his re-election chances. Now, it could help them depending on the outcome, but
only time will tell.
Yeah.
And there are some factors we can analyze there, but this could seriously hurt his re-election chances, and there's a very real possibility that this is his Achilles heel that will have him lose that election to come.
Yeah. And the sad thing is that really that shouldn't be the case.
At least I don't think so. I think
he'll still win.
This is the right thing to do. Yeah.
I think it's the right thing to do. I think he'll still win. And the thing is, when you are at war, people are less likely to want to change leaders because they want they want a person to see that through. Historically that's the case.
Commander in chief. Yeah.
Yes, but I simply want people to understand that everyone is anti-war. But that doesn't mean that there aren't wars that must be fought.
Right.
And this is one, and we've been beating this to death at this point, but the reason that I am continuing to harp on this point is because we need leaders like Trump who understand when war is necessary. It doesn't make him a warmonger, as many would claim, and people who understand the need for war aren't warmongers.
It's as unfair as calling someone who doesn't want war a coward. No, these are both valid perspectives. Sometimes war is necessary. Hopefully it isn't. Those are both valid.
Yes, and we don't want to. I don't want to go too much longer on this, but there has been a lot of propaganda about a lot of wars that we've been in, as we've talked about the sentiments that the U.S. is always in the wrong. That plays a lot into why people are so anti-war now. People thinking that we go to war for oil, or for other reasons that simply aren't the case.
Mike, I want to mention to you one thing that I had actually pulled from a Jordan Peterson podcast, and excluding any of his political ideas, he's a psychologist. He's a clinician, and describes one of his patients who was traumatized by her boyfriend trying to attack her, and the look on his face when he did so. And that's something that makes her wake up at night scared. And by the way, she didn't actually successfully get attacked, but it was the attempt to. And I think it's one of those things that he touches on, because in our society we've forgotten the idea of malevolence. We live in such a safe society and such a comfortable society that it is very easy to forget that there is malevolence in the world, and that some people do seek to harm others because they enjoy it.
Yeah.
And that your destruction might be something that is ravenously enticing to some. And so with that, I'd like to say that there is malevolence, and if not evil in the world, and something close enough to. And that there is no negotiating with that.
Yeah. And I think that sums it up perfectly. So I thank everyone for tuning into our podcast. Before we sign out, just remember that no one wants war, but sometimes you have to fight.
Yeah, I hope, and I truly do hope that whatever the outcome is, that it is at the cost of as few lives as possible. And I do believe that the actions that have transpired so far have represented that. And with that, only time will tell what comes in the future. Like you said, I hope that a war is not imminent, but should that be the case, it should only be the case in the preservation of lives.
Yes. As we have always done, as we have always pursued with our military.
Yeah.
The least casualties possible. For the safety of our nation and of our allies.
And with that, Mike, we're actually approaching about 2 hours here. And so thank you for those who have stuck around for the meat and bones of this.
Yeah, this has probably been our longest podcast.
This is our longest podcast.
I think it's a topic deserving of the extra time that we spent. And it is one that we will continue to see play out within the coming days and weeks and months.
And so once again, thank you for joining us here on our 5th episode of the Weekly Review, here with the Renaissance Men podcast, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you for your time.
Signing out.